We already discussed several times already how in the beginning of this game there were quite a few cards that had issues. Sometimes though, instead of doing bannings and erratas, they try to take a slower approach, which is to print cards to deal with cards. Magic the Gathering did this a lot with color hosers and things like that. And what they found out is something that I think Bandai is coming to understand, which is that when you make cards like that, it brings its own set of problems. A lot of the times they are not used for the intended purpose and causes design space issues. We have several of these cards right here. We're just going to get right into it. So we're going to go over all of them one at a time, and this is going to be a little longer video. But this way you can understand what they did, how they were restrictive, and why they were banned. So No Escape Son Goku. This one right here, if you read it, wouldn't be immediately apparent, especially if you were new to the game, why this card was a problem. But No Escape Son Goku was a huge issue because it was printed for a card before it even came out got banned, which was a legendary flute. So No Escape Son Goku comes down, draws you a card, and then for the rest of the game, your opponent cannot use non-keyword skills to return battle cards in the battle area to their own hands during their turn. I hate these game-long effects because there's zero way to interact with them. Of course, as I mentioned, it was meant to be used with flute, but later on they realized pretty quickly that it was going to cause design issues. Prime example of that was this Gogeta archetype. Now, this archetype was very cool, had a lot of strong things going for it, but the whole entire archetype was literally crapped all over by No Escape Son Goku. Why? Well, this card is a great example. It says, when you play this card, look at up to 3 cards to the top of your deck, choose up to 1 Veku or Vegeta BR card from among them, and blah, blah, but then it says that then at the end of the turn, return this card to its owner's hand. Now, it wasn't just this one card. Every Goku and Vegeta in the archetype had this effect. Because it had this effect, you would just play this No Escape, and now they were not able to return those cards to their hand. And because they were able to return the cards to their hand, it limited their options as far as fusing and things like that. So they got rid of it because, again, design space limitations. With this being out the way, then they could print stuff like the Sherman Salsa, the original archetype, that also required non-keyword skills to return cards to hands. Force Ejection Mass Saiyan is probably the funniest one on the list for a couple of reasons. One, this card was extremely oppressive until a ruling was put out. And two, it was banned not for what it did. So you see this guy, 315k, overwhelm 3 for 1 energy. And it says, activate main once per turn if you have placed a card in your energy area during your charge phase this turn. And you have less energy than your opponent. Choose one of your opponent's energy and send it to their warp. So the wording of this card was super duper weird. Because the way you read it would be that you would play this card, and when you do this activate main, if you met the condition of having charge this turn and your opponent has less energy than you, you would send the card to the warp. That's how I read English, but obviously that was not exactly the case. So the purpose of this card, first of all, was to handle Heightened Evolution Super Saiyan 3 Son Goku. They would pitch your card, go up 2 energy, you would get 3 cards at a drop, and it's a black leader, pay 1 overround this, and warp 1 of their energy. Problem with that was that if this card was not in your opening hand, it did absolutely nothing to SS3. So it had to be like in your opening hand, one of the first things you play. Also, this card was terrible against SS3 when you were going first. So you had to be going second, and you had to open it in order for it to actually do anything to SS3. Now, why was this card oppressive? Well, again, you read the card, you believe you have an understanding of it. So this deck occurred. This deck is one of the most oppressive decks to resist, which is the Vegeta Energy Lock deck. A lot of people who I talked to are like, hey, remember that Vegeta Energy Lock deck? They go, no, we don't know what you're talking about. Basically, this guy has the ability to draw a card, bounce an energy to your hand, and then choose up to 1 card in your hand and put it in your energy. It was meant to be like this cool untapping ability that didn't actually involve untapping. But instead what happened was you will overwhelm this guy, swing, bounce the energy you most likely use to overwhelm him, and then you will activate his activate main to warp one of your opponent's energy, and you would keep them down at a low energy amount, usually 2 to 3 energy. And you were able to loop this card over and over again with the use of the legendary flute, because of course it's a flute target. And that would be the deck. You would play 1/2 swap storm while keeping your opponent's energy at a very low level. It was a really, really strong deck. But what Bandai did with this was interesting. It had a Q&A about the card come up. And it says, do you check if you have less energy in your opponent condition of this card skill when you play this card? And it says no, that you have less energy than your opponent condition of this card skill is referring to your energy state when you place energy during your charge phase. But that's what the ruling did, and by doing that, it kind of depowered and also overpowered the card. Because what this then meant was, as long as that condition was true, you could have any number of these on the table and they will all work, no matter what your opponent's current energy was at. But it was mainly a side deck card regardless, and hyper ramping was kind of kept in check by this card, Dende, and various other cards at the time. But it was eventually banned because they wanted to clean up the hate cards going into Unison Warrior format, and they just got rid of this card along with a couple others. These next two cards are examples of, well, this one particularly is an example of a card not being used the way intended. So Mercenary Tao, Ruthless Trainer, and Tian Shenhan, Returning Fire, were both color hosers printed to help deal with two problematic things going on. One, hand control was really good at the time, and Mercenary Tao was printed as a hand control hate because it says if your opponent's leader is green or yellow, reduce the energy cost to discard in your hand by 1. So you would play this out, have barrier, not a lot of barrier hate at the time, so you kind of just stuck around. And it had an auto once per turn that when a card in your hand is placed in your drop area by an opponent's skill, your opponent chooses 3 cards in their hand and send it to their warp. So you would go, okay, well, that would prevent them from, making you discard cards due to a skill. Yes, but it doesn't say that exactly. So the card that mainly predatored was Preemptive Strike. Preemptive Strike prevents you from playing a really strong card that costs 4 or less. But because it says the battle card your opponent is being played had an individual cost of 4 or less, it is placed in its owner's drop instead of being played. If it was a card they were playing from their hand and you Preemptive Strike, it would go from their hand to the drop. That would then trigger Tau and make your opponent warp 3 cards from their hand. So now Tau became an anti-counterplay card for green against green, and you would even hardcast it for 2 because it was not too much to ask for 2 when you knew you were going into a red deck that had Denial of Hope. So Tau was being abused for a purpose that it was not intentionally made for. Tian Shenhan, which is way too good at his job. So the purpose of Tian Shenhan, as you see, he costs 1 if your opponent's leader was red or blue. And it says, when you play this card, your opponent can't switch energy to active mode with non-awakened skills until the end of your opponent's next turn. So this did a couple of things. 1, it made it so that they could not Dimension Magic or Xeno Button or Bean if you were a blue deck. And also, it prevented them from using their leader skills to untap energy on their next turn to be able to crack back at you. So you will play Tien, you will most likely win the game that turn, and then even if you didn't, your opponent was limited in the amount of energy they got to use on the following turn. Again, both of them got hit, deservedly so. They were a little bit too powerful for what they were doing. Minus Killing Zone did what it was intended to do, it did it way too well. So Minus Killing Zone says, send 3 cards from your drop area to your warp, draw a card. Your opponent may not activate counterplay skills for the duration of the turn. So the purpose at the time was to deal with Cold Bloodlust. Problem is, Cold Bloodlust leaders kind of went in and out of vogue depending on what the format was and what was good and what wasn't. So Minus Killing Zone became either very useful or trash real easy. The other thing was people were sometimes just using it as an upstart goblin since you could just draw a card by using 0 energy and warping 3 cards from your drop. But then people realized that they could just play, 4 good cards in their deck and not mess around with Minus Killing Zone. But what happened? Well, Killing Zone was released in set 4. But when set 7 came out, we got Champa the Trickster. Chopper the Trickster was meant to deal with an issue of Bandai's creating. That issue being that they printed a very powerful, or a couple of very powerful boss monsters with deflect and barrier, which meant that there was not a very easy or reasonable way to deal with them. Cold Bloodlust did not work on these guys, and they usually had multiple strikes in them in some way of inhibiting your ability to defend them. So Chopper the Trickster would come down, as it says, his counterplay skill was just to play himself, and then his auto was to choose one of your opponent's battle cards, ignoring barrier, and switch to the rest mode, and draw a card of your opponent's turn. And Butai Ito did something similar, except for one energy. You got to sack them, and you got to choose one of your opponent's battle cards, ignoring barrier that had a higher energy cost than what their energy was, and you get to switch to the rest mode. Both of them great cards, and it helped to curb, to a certain degree, that issue as long as you were playing yellow as one of your colors. But we all remember this deck right here, Broly Haida Mastery, right? We talked about it during the Storm video. When you were going against opposing decks that had yellow in them, you would just bring in minus Killing Zone. So you would go into Path of Greatness, and then on the following turn, you will play a minus Killing Zone, draw a card, and you were free to go height into killing them or height into Victory Strike and killing them without any fear of any kind of repercussion. It did it, again, it did what it was supposed to do, stop your opponents from stopping your plays, just did it a little bit too well. So it had to be banned so that then the counter plays actually meant something. And if they needed to deal with a boss monster, they just printed a bunch of deflects, which, again, not a big fan of. Alright, Son Goku True Fighting Spirit. This is the most recent one of this list. Son Goku True Fighting Spirit was used in Black Saiyan decks to completely prevent your opponent from being able to negate attacks economically. Before the errata, it just had deflect. It was a 15k take a life guy. Then if your leader card is a Black Saiyan card where your opponent activates a counter skill, they choose what card they had and send it to the war, but you could stack multiple of these up on the table so that if you were coming through for an Alpha Strike, your opponent activates a counter skill, they have to warp 2-3 cards out of their hand. It became a very hard thing to justify. After errata, they made it unique so that way you couldn't just stack multiple copies up. I think that's probably the best way to do it. You still want to have some type of a hate to allow you to go in, but you didn't want it to be so oppressive that your opponent could not even play the game. So we already talked about how these cards work. I think there's a couple more cards that should be on this list, and we're going to talk about them right now. First off is Time Control Cronoa. Time Control Cronoa has dodged the ban list a bunch of times. It is not that Cronoa is particularly a problematic card. My issue with Cronoa was that it was printed for a specific card, Unwavering Solidarity Shigesh. So Shigesh was used to play Saiyan's 3 cost when you super combo with him. And Cronoa says if you try to play battle cards off a super combo skill, they will not be able to do so. And this effect, again, it lasts for the entire game. And you just play it, draw a card, and it just happens. And there's no interaction with it. Cronoa was so bad during its heyday that Shigesh would be split or taken out of decks entirely just because this card existed. That's why when we go back to this Broly Haida Mastery deck, you see that they had this 2-2 split of Shigesh. If Cronoa didn't exist, you have 4 of it, but they did a 2-2 split. So it did its job. It scared people away from Shigesh. But then they banned Shigesh, and other cards were made with these kind of effects. A contemporary Shigesh that never got played for a couple reasons was Plucky Dynasty Pan. Plucky Dynasty Pan had a swap for 5 for 3 energy. Returns to your hand, make a 5-drop. Problem was, this is a super combo. And you're playing a card with the skill of super combo. Cronoa stops it. I remember when Bulma came out. I was like, man, I think people might just start playing Cronoa again. Didn't happen because Bulma as a super combo got power crept immediately by Raditz' super combo. But Bulma is a really cool super combo of red Earthlings that will really become a thing. And Cronoa would basically make this card completely invalid. I remember when I read this card, I was like, man, this card is really cool. You have a Shigesh for a blue Bardock Screw. Problem is, Cronoa exists. So why would I take the risk of playing this card if my opponent could just play this card on turn 1 and invalidate my super combo? And of course, they revisited swap again with the Burra. If people wanted to use his super combo and the deck ever became good, card completely shuts it down. And then you could just keep going forward. They could never make a super combo that summons a guy from hand because Cronoa exists. Next up is the cunning cards. I don't mind stuff like the Burnished Bond, Borgos, and that cycle because you can interact with that card as a blue player, get rid of it, and then allow yourself to do all your untappings like you would normally do. I don't even so much hate the barrier guys that prevent like dimension magic from happening and so forth. These cards, on the other hand, are a different animal. Again, it has that text that for the duration of the game, they are not allowed to untap energy with a battle card or extra card skill during their turn, unless they warp 5 cards for the drop area from the warp. That, to me, that whole for the game stuff just should not exist as far as a hate card. There's a fine balance to be had when creating a silver bullet or a hate card in this game. And if you do it wrong, if you make it too tuned or it gets abused in unintentional ways, you have situations like those cards we just looked at where cards are banned, limited, or errata. So I'll catch you again next time. And this is VG Time signing out.